Okay, my name is Amie Phelan Lee Garapich. I was born on January 12th, 1946 in Chula Vista, California, and I've lived here my entire life. My father was born in Ipoh, Malaya, where his parents came to work in the tin mines. And he was, because he was pretty intelligent, he got a scholarship to go to University of Philippines to get his Bachelor of Arts, and then from there he got a scholarship to Yale University to get his PhD, which he got in Oriental philosophy. During this period of time, he met my mother at Northwestern University when they were both going to summer school, and they married in 1939, and within a year they decided to go back to China because of the inclusion laws. My father could not get a job here or work here because he was not a citizen of the U.S. So they went back to China, and he got a teaching job at Nanking University. They lived in Shanghai. They went to Shanghai, and he got a job at Nanking University. My mother taught in the foreign settlement in Shanghai English to foreign nationals. So during the war, somewhere in that period, well, 1941, my brother was born there, and he was imprisoned somewhere in the next couple of years. I'm not sure exactly the date, but he was imprisoned by the Japanese because my father was yes, I'm sorry. He was imprisoned by the Japanese because they felt that he was an intellectual and that he might incite the Chinese nationals. And so then he went to prison for about a year. And meanwhile, they also found my mother and brought her into court, and they were going to imprison her. But a gentleman that I think he might have been one of the parents of one of the students spoke up for her and said that she was a good woman and that she also had a son, and that there would be nowhere to put the son. And so they let her go. So meanwhile, at the end of the war in 1945, they left right after the war ended and came back to the United States. Okay, so after the war, they immediately decided to leave China as soon as they could. They found a military ship that would take them, but they had to leave within about 24 hours. So my mother had to get all of her belongings and anything that she felt were valuable in a big, huge trunk. And so off they went in this military ship. And you have to remember, it's right after the war, and there were all sailors on there, and my brother was 4 years old, and so they really spoiled him a lot with candy and everything. So then I think it took us about a month to get here, okay? And when they get off the ship, one of my cousins was there to meet them so that they could be at the port, so they could get off the ship and wouldn't have to necessarily go through Angel Island and go through all that process. Right. Okay, and they were going to go, they were going to go to, go back east. That was the plan, to go back east. But my mother was very pregnant. She was going to have me in a couple of months. So they decided they would just go down and visit my Aunt Amie in Chula Vista, who was a pharmacist.
Your cousin's mother? The cousin
Yeah,
who met you
her stepmother.
Oh.
Okay. And so we went ahead and came down here, and then my mother had me, and of course it was on a Saturday, and I don't know where my father was, but my aunt took her to my Aunt Amie took her to the hospital, so she's outside the door, and so I'm Amie because of it. And when my family first came to San Diego, they moved out to the El Cajon area, not knowing the area itself and realizing that it was a very conservative area. So when the neighbors finally found out that there was a mixed couple in their neighborhood, they set up a petition and took it around to all the neighbors and had them sign it. So they were basically forced to move out of the area. Okay, so from there, And part of the reason, obviously, that this happened is there was a lot of discrimination in housing and also exclusion laws that were still in effect at the time. And not until really in the 50s and 60s did these change. And so, not that they necessarily had any basis for what they did, but obviously it was easier for my parents to move out. Right, and then they moved from there to San Diego area of City Heights, and bought a house there, a nice home there. And this was right, you have to understand that it was right after World War II, and there was still a lot of discrimination against Asians, I guess you'd say. And so when we went to school, or when we grew up in the neighborhood, kids didn't know whether we were Japanese or Chinese, and they used to call us Japs. And of course we'd have to correct them. And then one kid even had the audacity, I guess you'd say, to ask if my parents cut my hair putting a bowl on top of my head. So that was a little embarrassing for a kid my age. But I think that a lot of this happened because we lived in a very white, middle-class neighborhood. Okay? So, but during our first years in San Diego, my father became pastor of the Chinese, which was then called the Chinese Community Church. And he was instrumental, however, in renaming it as a Protestant denomination, calling it, would now be named the Chinese Congregational Community Church. So that was important because it made the church part of the whole church family in San Diego, and so then they became a member of the Council of Churches. So my father through the years, became a pretty influential person in the Chinese community. He became active in the Chinese Benevolent Association. He served as vice president. Dr. He, who was a local herbalist, was the president at that time. He also founded the Chinese Chamber of Commerce and the Miss Chinatown beauty pageant that was held during the New Year's, Chinese New Year's. He also served as president of the House of Pacific Relations, obviously representing the House of China. And he did several terms as the president of the House. Okay.
Talk a little bit about what the House of Pacific Relations is and does.
Okay, well, it's a group of houses that's in Balboa Park, and it has different countries. I think there's probably, I think they're getting a couple more now too. I think there was probably about 20 of them. I could name some of them, of course, obviously China, Sweden, Norway, Germany, France, Israel was in there, Japan, I think Japan was in there, probably like Switzerland, quite a few of the European countries were in there. So it was a pretty diversion of houses, and it's as far as I know, it's still pretty active in the community.
The House of China is definitely very active.
Right. And so then he also, that I remembered, he for several years was the Consul General for the San Diego Chinese community, and which meant that he would welcome. There were ships that would come in from the Taiwanese Navy, and he would socialize with the generals, and in turn they would invite my family down for Chinese dinner on the ships.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have memories of any of the dinners? What were they like?
Oh my gosh, they were great because they were like banquets, even though it was on a ship, you know. And I just remember them because they were really quite fancy. Yeah, they really went all out for it.
Was it a really large table?
Yeah, there was a large, in one of the room, I guess stateroom you want to call it. It was very large tables, and then we would sit there with them. And it's almost it would be all officers that came, but the Chinese.
How many people?
Oh, I would say depended, you know. I think it seemed like there was about 10,
Okay.
10, and
Yeah,
then with my
it's a
family.
pretty-
It was a big ship, but they were
Yeah.
big military ships, you know. I don't know if they were destroyers, I'm not sure what kind they were, but they were definitely the Taiwanese Navy.
Right.
From the ages of about 10 to 13, I attended the Chinese language school for about twice a week during these years. We had classes in quite different places. They kept changing them. I did for quite a while. We had it at the church, and then for a short period of time it was at the Chinese Benevolent Association, and then there were some other venues around the same area. Some were a little bit out of Chinatown, but those are the two that I remember that were in Chinatown. Okay, I had two different teachers. For the most of the time during those years, I had a little small petite woman by the name of Miss Chu, and she just came from China. Okay, and then also for a shorter period of time, I had a man who had just recently come from China also teach me. We did learn Cantonese mainly because all the Chinese in San Diego spoke Cantonese because they were from the Guangdong province, and so that's what they spoke. We obviously were taught the language, but we also did calligraphy using the brushes. So we would make big, because the big brushes, there were big brushes, so we do those, you know, quite a bit. As far as the friends that I had in the Chinese language school, I had two girlfriends who were sisters, and their names, I'm pretty sure one was Mary, I'm not sure about the second one, but I think her name was Dorothy Hom. Anyway, they did not live in Chinatown.
Okay.
They lived in the Loma Portal area, because their father owned a restaurant called Chinaland.
Okay.
But we would somehow meet up sometimes, get off the bus and see each other. And so one time when we were coming down through this derelict area, I guess you'd call it, with peep shows, we stopped and looked at a burlesque theater billboard, which had these scantily clad women in it and everything. And anyway, there was a ticket box there, and a woman was in there, and she came out of the ticket box and told us that girls like us should not be looking at pictures like this, and she made us go on. But I did come down here twice a week. I got out of regular school, got on the bus, came down to downtown, walked through this area, which was not completely desirable, but it was my way of connecting with the community and learning the language. The other thing that I can remember down here, especially when I was in Chinese language school and coming down here, was that where the Horton Grand Hotel is now, there was a whole row of 1.5-story houses. At that point, which was right in the 50s, there was a lot of the Chinese had left the area, but it was almost all senior Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Was
and
that part of an organization, or?
no, they were just the older Chinese that stay down here.
Okay.
Basically, they either chose to stay here, or I don't know why they stayed, but it was almost like senior Chinese housing is what it was. Yeah. And they would, in the backyards, they would grow produce, and so it was just their little piece of land. One family that lived there anyway, they had there was a very old Chinese woman that lived there, and she was either this boy that came to Chinese school, she was either his grandmother or his great-grandmother, probably the great-grandmother, because he was young and she was very old. But he was always go ahead of her and say, "Move it, old lady." Yeah, and so that course right away hit me. And she would just be smiling, so I don't think she understood any English. But the reason she could not move as fast as most people, because she had bound feet. And so that was kind of really sort of stood out for me at the time, because I knew she had bound feet. When he said that, then it all of a sudden hit me that here's somebody with bound feet and they can't go any faster. Yeah, literally. Okay, when I would come down to Chinatown mainly to come to Chinese language school twice a week, and also I would come down about once a week with my dad to go to the market, Chang. I would go to different establishments around the area. One of them that I really enjoyed was the Kim Wing store, which was next to Chang. And it was a really interesting little store because it was very narrow and much, much smaller than Chang. But they had a whole rows. As you came in the door, they had rows of candies and fruits and dried fruits. And so I would frequent them quite a bit. Yeah. And I remember the little old man, because he was old even for me, that would be there. I would guess, but I'm not positive, but I think he was the original proprietor who had opened the store in 1889. Oh, yes, wow. Yeah. So I kind of think that he was. I mean, because he was old enough to be, because we were saying, okay, if he left, even if he came here in his 40s, he would have been 60s, 70s then, or maybe 80s, but he was pretty old. Okay, then, of course, we would go down to, I do remember throughout this whole area, there were planks. Instead of sidewalks, there were planks. And I think this was done because they didn't want to put the money in to put sidewalks. Okay,
because the city didn't want to put the money in?
I think so. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know the reason, but I think it's interesting that the rest of the city had sidewalks and they had planks that went down to the earth. Yeah, okay. So anyway, but one of the, obviously, besides the King Wing store, probably the most important grocery store here was Chang's. And it was, of course, bigger than the King Wing store. And the eldest son, his name was Jennings Hom, he had decided to move it from its original place right next to Kim Wing and to the corner of 3rd and Island. Okay. It was much bigger. Yeah, it's much bigger. It was on the corner, so it was much bigger. Yeah. And so when we would come down, my dad and I would come down at least once a week because he did a lot of the cooking, and he wanted to have fresh produce, meat, and tofu. So, and you have to understand also that it was probably the one and only full Chinese grocery in San Diego, because at the time there were less than 1,000 Chinese in San Diego. Okay, I would also remember when I would come down that there was an older gentleman there, who I knew for sure was the original proprietor. I mean, I knew that because that was his father, James' father, and he would, and that was started in 1899. So you can understand the chronology there. But he was always there, and he would be doing anything. He would work in the butcher, he would sweep the floors, or he'd work on the desk, on the counter, whatever he needed to be done, he was there. Oh, also, in this same neighborhood down the street was the Alquin Produce. Okay, and it was a very... I don't know if there was a relationship. I mean, you know, they obviously they were only down the street, but they were across from the Chinese Benevolent Association. Anyway, it was very busy, I remember, because there was trucks going in and out, delivering produce at all hours of the day and night. And usually, most of the time, we would come down, obviously, after school. So it was a little later in the day when we would come down. So I remember that part. Also, as a family, we would attend many social and cultural activities down here, mainly at the CCBA. Everything was upstairs because downstairs were businesses, and also the Lucky Lion downstairs all the activities in Chinese Benevolent Association were upstairs, and all that downstairs were businesses like a Changhua school or whatever was downstairs. There was always some other business. Yeah. So they had nothing down there at that point for the Chinese. Right. I mean, I should say the cultural activities were all upstairs. Right. And they also, of course, had the Lucky Lion dancers on a special occasion, especially New Year.
Talking about Chinese New Year, I know that CCBA, at least currently, they have a pretty significant Chinese New Year festival.
Right.
Where the streets are closed.
Correct.
Do you know when that started?
Oh, I was back then. It was going on. So when it started, I wouldn't be surprised it went back into 30s and 40s.
Oh,
Yeah. So it's been a very, very traditional. So it hasn't stopped, which I think is great. Yeah. So, but you have to remember that most of the activities in the area were either out of the church or out of CCBA.
Yeah.
Okay. But these were both very small facilities. And so they really liked going, especially in the summers, they liked going to different venues, especially like, I remember that, I do remember one thing, I just thought of this, talking about the church. One time, my dad, my brother and I, this is kind of interesting, we sang the Chinese national anthem. He sang it, I played the piano, and my brother played the violin.
Oh, okay,
I thought that was kind of interesting.
Is that at the church?
Yeah, at the church. Yeah, it was kind of interesting. Okay. So anyway, when I was talking about the activities, like for example, at the House Pacific Relations, the whole Chinese, all the girls that were in the Chinese language school sang Chinese songs at the House Pacific Relations when it was House of China's turn to have the program.
Oh.
Okay, and and I found a picture, and we had our little, outfits on, our little, and then a lot of the times after this, since it was the House of China's Day, afterwards the Chinese women would come and they would bring they would have like a potluck and have all their different dishes out on the lawn. And they did the same thing in Balboa Park. They would sometimes just have something out there just to get together so that they could serve all their dishes.
Yeah, I remember that you'd spoken a little bit about the Nanking Cafe.
Right.
You have really vivid memories that it was somewhere that your family would have meals pretty frequently.
Right.
And you have, like, the interior of the restaurant was really memorable.
Yes.
Would you like to talk a little bit about
Yes.
that?
So this was where many evenings were spent dining out with my family. The interior was really interesting. It was all retro lime green. Okay, and you walked in the door, and it was this long, beautiful bar on the front of it. And then you walked in, there was a big jukebox. Then you went in, and there were all booths that were all almost like enclosed. And, they would have there were obviously booths. And at every booth, they had a turnstile that, for the jukebox. And so on this turnstile, you could turn it around to the different tunes of the time or hits, and so if you found one, then you'd punch it in, and then it would come up on the jukebox.
Cool.
Yeah, so that was neat.
Sounds like something that you maybe had fun with.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun with it, and so it was always a treat for me to go down there.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the other restaurants that we would frequent, but was mainly for banquets, was George Joe's restaurant. Okay.
Where was George Joe's?
Now, George Joe's was just a little out of Chinatown. It wasn't right in Chinatown. It was, maybe a block or two away. But it was a very nice restaurant. It had a very beautiful interior decor, and most of the attendees that came to these banquets, because he had a lot of banquets, were leaders of the Chinese community. Okay. So one of these banquets that I went to, and we went to a lot of them.
These were banquets that your father organized, correct?
Yeah, he would organize them, or somebody would organize them, but he was always there.
Right,
Okay.
right.
And this particular one, the keynote speaker at the time was the governor, or Lieutenant Governor of the State of California. Okay, and for some reason, my dad told me to come up and sit next to him.
Okay, yeah.
So his name was Glenn Anderson. Okay, and most of the time that we were sitting there talking to, he was talking to me about government and how it worked. And it was really fascinating for me because I was younger. I mean, I was about 13, so, I was in junior high school. And he had written a book about government. And so he gave me the book, signed it, and gave it to me. Okay, coincidentally, about a couple of months later, or maybe weeks, but I think it was a couple of months later, I went to a grand opening of the San Diego Democratic Party headquarters with my girlfriend. It was just like a couple blocks from our house, which is interesting. Anyway, while we were there, Governor Pat Brown was supposed to come and sort of like, he was scheduled to appear anyway. So when he walked in the door, he asked where Amie Lee was. And so somebody pointed him out to me, and he came over and we talked for a while.
Yeah,
and I think that it was because the Lieutenant Governor Glenn Anderson had told him about me.
Yeah, that's an interesting story.
Sorry, yeah, it is in a story.